Well, good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you, and I have to say that since arriving in Brazil, Casey and I feel so welcome. The Brazilian hospitality is unbeatable, and your food is amazing, and your coffee is amazing, so I just want to say thank you. Yeah. So I am going to be speaking to you today a little bit about, as you can see, how to make chemistry fun by teaching intelligent design in the origin of life. And as I do so, I need to share some disclaimers with you. So firstly, I am a high school science teacher. I am not a PhD. I just want to put that out there. My husband, who you just heard from, Casey Luskin, he has twisted my arm. He pushed me to do this talk, and metaphorically, of course, I'm in good health, but he really owes me big time. I have never actually given a talk at a conference ever. Never, ever. And so while I'm excited to be here, I do continue to look for the nearest exit to get out. So I just want to be honest about that. But to kind of just introduce and have a little fun here, a few just fun things about myself. In the upper left there, so my husband Casey and I live in Seattle, Washington. And in February this year, we did some wonderful hiking in the snow. We love to go kayaking together. And I've also just enjoyed doing some hikes myself. If you've never been to the Pacific Northwest, it is absolutely gorgeous, and there's wonderful places to hike and enjoy the outdoors. The less exciting stuff, actually one other fun thing that I want to mention. Do I have anyone in the audience that enjoys watching food vloggers on YouTube? Do I have any fans of people traveling? No, I'm shocked. Okay, so, I do, I see a friend. Okay, so I have an obsession with finding people on YouTube who travel around the world and eat food from different countries. And one of my favorite YouTube vloggers is a gentleman, take note, my friends, Mark Wiens. Mark Wiens will eat anywhere. He has traveled to Pakistan. He has traveled to Saudi Arabia. And a video I found of him was a trip to Rio de Janeiro. And he decided that he wanted to actually go into the favelas and have a home-cooked meal. And so here Mark Wiens is climbing up the steps of an apartment in a Rio de Janeiro favela to have a home-cooked meal by a wonderful, hospitable auntie. Here she is preparing what I believe is a pretty traditional Brazilian dish. And okay, I'm seeing some heads nodding, all right. And then here's Mark Wiens enjoying this sumptuous meal. And I'm going to tell you right now, as I do this presentation, I'm just going to imagine that I'm Mark. So I forget all about the fact that I need to be talking up here, and I'm going to pretend I'm at the favela apartment having a great meal, and then I'm just going to feel a lot better. But highly recommend checking out Mark Wiens. Now, a few other things about me, so you have a little bit of background. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of California, Riverside, and I also have a Master's of Secondary Teaching from Western Washington University. I've got about 15 years of experience teaching online, both online and in person, as well as tutoring. And about 10 of those years were actually in the U.S. public school system. But more recently, I have been getting involved a little bit more with intelligent design. Usually I left that for my husband, but I've kind of been dragged into this a little bit. And so in September of 2024, I helped launch something called Discovery Institute Academy. This is an online high school program that's currently offering high school chemistry and high school biology. It is geared towards integrating intelligent design, and it is also geared for homeschool students as well as private school students. At the moment, we are offering both live synchronous courses, but also courses that are asynchronous. And so we're actually about to start our third year. Now, I want to tell you as we jump into this, now that you know I'm a high school teacher and not a PhD, this is what I am not going to do today. I am definitely not giving a detailed lecture on chemical evolution or a deep dive on all the various ID topics, all right? I'm going to leave that for our expert friends. I am going to be also not covering all the intersections that there are between high school chemistry and ID. There's just so much. Our point today is just to scratch the surface, just touch what a high school student might think about intelligent design. What I am going to do today is explain how high school chemistry can integrate intelligent design. And what do I mean by this? Well, I want to think about the basic concepts in high school chemistry and how they can help a high school student see why chemical evolution and the origin of life is quite scientifically flawed, and how life actually requires an intelligent designer. Now, to get all of us situated, again, I want to think like a high school student. It's helpful to know what's the storyline of kind of the origin of life paradigm. And so there's some supposed major steps that are in this process. Step one is we need to establish a habitable world for life. Step two is something called prebiotic synthesis. This is the point where we need to make life's basic building blocks, the monomers, the amino acids, the nucleotides. Step three in this process of the origin of life is we need to undergo polymerization, a fancy word for saying we need to link those small building blocks of life into longer macromolecules. Step four is we need to form vesicles. We need to protect those biomolecules in some kind of house. Now, step five is we arrive at our first protocell. And it has some self-replication abilities, some copying abilities. And finally, somehow, we go from the first cell to everything else. Now, I want to say up front, there's plenty of questions that can be put out about how we go from the first cell to the rest of life. But the reality is, there are questions at every one of these junctions. Plenty of clever scientists that are far smarter than me are running all kinds of scientific tests to think about ways that all of these steps could be carried out in a blind, unguided process, but they're running into some common problems, some challenges and obstacles. What I want to do today is not walk you through that full process. I want to pretend that you are my high school students today, and I want us to focus like a high school student on prebiotic synthesis, polymerization, and vesicles, and to think about this through a lens of a high school chemistry class. And so to do so, here's the first of 3 points that I want to think about in terms of a high school chem class. Firstly, high school chemistry labs, basic high school chemistry labs, folks, help students see why origin of life prebiotic synthesis experiments would never work on the early Earth. Now, to start us off on this, let's go back to the roadmap and let's again say that at this point, we're going to focus as a high school student at stage 2. We're going to think about prebiotic synthesis. And as we do so, here's some points we want to think about. Origin of life researchers claim they can produce these primitive organic molecules, in other words, monomers, amino acids, nucleotides, through, and this is key, prebiotic synthesis experiments that simulate realistic conditions on the early Earth. Now, these experiments involve a series of chemical reactions similar to those actually that a high school student might do in their course. And so with this in mind, let's think about prebiotic synthesis through the lens of a high school chemistry course. And to do so, let's look at a case study. In fact, let's examine an experiment by one of my young female chemists in class, a student who decided to run their own back-to-back single replacement reaction. Now, what I'm going to show you here is her slide in the end of the year presentation with her colleagues. And she's a very ambitious young lady. She's a very curious young lady. And she decided that she would run a sequence of 2 different reactions. Now, the first one you see there, and for the chemists in the audience, they're starting to yawn. They're like, yeah, okay. For those that are not, here's what she did. She took a piece of zinc metal, the silver metal you see, and she put it into that yellow-brown solution called iron 3 chloride. Now, in the process, she was hoping to kick out the iron metal from the solution. The zinc comes along and it sees the iron and it says, get out. So that's what she was hoping to do. Then she wanted to run a second experiment right afterwards, where she was going to take some magnesium metal, that's that silver ribbon, and she was now going to put it in a solution she made from the first experiment. That's that clear vial of zinc 2 chloride. Well, her hope in this experiment was to get back the very first, the zinc metal she started with. That's what she wanted to do. Here is her results that she shared in her end of the year presentation, which I thought were so honest and objective. So here's her, actually before I do that, let me share 3 common problems and then I'm going to show you how her experiment shows this. So first of all, you get lots of stuff or products that you don't want. This happens in chemistry. Secondly, you get very little of the product that you do want. And this is called the mass transfer problem. We're going to talk about that more later. But finally, the stuff that you do want tends to be drowned out by the stuff that you don't want. And so in our young lady's experiment, here is what she began to see and appreciate for herself. In her results, you can see the following. Our young lady notes, and these are her slides again, she says, quote, time ran out. And thus, the single replacement reaction, the second one, was never run. She goes on to say in her notes, quote, solid iron was barely visible. And she goes on to say, actually, that solid iron could not be distinguished from potential zinc flakes. She wasn't sure what was product and what was not. She wasn't sure. And then she adds this in her presentation. She says the amount of product from the reaction was so minuscule that the scale used didn't even register things that small. Now, if you'll look on her slide, do you guys see the blue circle she did on her slide? That's my awesome student trying to show you that those flecks of, dust in there, maybe that was her desired product, but she wasn't sure. And so I thought this was a very honest assessment of her results. But the question becomes, how does this relate to the origin of life research? What's the connection? And so the first connection that I want to do is I'm going to call this the goop in the soup problem, all right? Our student produced a mixture of desired product plus goop and junk that you don't want. Furthermore, the desired product couldn't be distinguished from all the goop and the junk without additional analysis. And in fact, in a real chemistry lab, getting rid of the goop and the junk and extracting the desired product would require additional purification separation type steps. Now, of course, how is a blind, unguided chemical evolutionary process going to carry out this separation process on its own? And the answer is it won't. You need a skilled chemist for that. But there are no skilled chemists on the early earth. And so a high school student quickly understands the problems that arise in prebiotic synthesis. It's just like her lab. She sees this. Now, another connection to our young lady's science experiment, again, and I mentioned this term earlier, is this mass transfer problem. And so if our student did not make any product, let's assume she didn't make any of the desired product that she wanted to, it was only present in a tiny amount, not enough to move on to the next reaction. Well, this is a common problem in prebiotic synthesis experiments. And the chemical reaction, it either doesn't synthesize enough of the product to kick off the next reaction, or it's tangled up in just a mixture of unwanted byproducts or junk. Now, to speak to this mass transfer issue, again, how do origin of life researchers get around this mass transfer problem? Because clearly they need to. Well, they use a process called relay synthesis. In other words, they cheat. And so to understand mass transfer, forgive all the text up there, but I want to quote a synthetic chemist, Dr. James Tour from Rice University, and here's how he explains relay synthesis. Hang with me, because if this doesn't make sense, I will boil it down. Quote, one origin of life research team will publish a paper where they make a trace amount of stereochemically impure product. And then the next researcher will use that formerly published result as their starting point for the next synthetic step, claiming a protocol called relay synthesis. But the new researcher will either buy the intermediate in large amounts and pure homochiral form, or make it using purely advanced synthesis, separation, and characterization means. They will not use that former, cumbersome, proposed prebiotic route. So there is no accountability of mass transfer when going from one published work to the next. And here's what he concludes with. A prebiotic world would never have such a luxury. True. Now, if you're still confused about what on earth relay synthesis is, I've got a flow chart for you. And so here we go. We're going to walk this out in 4 steps. We've got a researcher. She makes a chemical reaction that only produces a tiny amount of the desired product. That's your green speck. Now, our researcher realizes, uh-oh, I've got a problem. I haven't made enough product to kickstart the next reaction. Oh, but wait, the researcher figures out a solution. They go out and they buy lots of pure product and use it in the next reaction step. In fact, if they were in Seattle, they would just Amazon Prime it and it would arrive in the next half hour. And so then our researcher runs the next step in the reaction series using lots of industrial, pure purchased product from the previous step. That's relay synthesis in a nutshell. Now, still confused? Think along these lines. In a normal chemistry research setting, there's nothing wrong with using relay synthesis. But if the goal is to simulate actual early Earth conditions in origin of life research, that's kind of cheating, right? Because large amounts of pure product would never be available to kickstart the next step of the reaction. Now, if you're still confused, here's another analogy. Is there any bakers in the audience? Anybody like to bake cakes and pastries and cook? Okay, a few of you. So I don't. But I want to maybe connect relay synthesis to baking. Suppose a baker bakes a cake. They're following a recipe. But they start the recipe with a fully baked cake. All right? The only thing left for them to do is put the icing on the cake. And then the baker says, I made the cake. Okay? Did they? No, they didn't bake the cake. They put icing on a pre-made cake. And so again, I would call relay synthesis in the setting of an origin of life, it's kind of cheating. It's like starting with a fully baked cake. Now, this is a quote here from Dr. Rob Stadler. Rob Stadler is a PhD from Harvard, MIT, in the Division of Health Sciences and Technology. Here's what he says about relay synthesis. This relay synthesis approach is essentially a silent confession that the products of their first experiment are not of practical use. A relay synthesis approach is required because of the poor concentration of product and the preponderance of impurities resulting from the first reaction. Makes sense. And I think if you're a high school student, here's what you take away. Laboratory experiments like the ones kids do in school use controlled conditions, have detailed methods, and they don't produce desired results without significant help from the experimenter. This makes blind, unguided chemical evolutionary processes on early Earth unlikely to produce the basic molecules needed for life. High school chemistry students, again, they experience this firsthand when they're trying to do their basic chemistry experiments. Extra credit. How many of you get extra credit in your classes as a kid? I know my students, if I say extra credit, they're excited, extra points. Here's where we want to take our students. If a skilled chemist is always needed to make origin of life prebiotic synthesis experiments work, well, this suggests that intelligent design is required to produce the molecules needed for life. But that's not the only connection a high school student can make. So here's our second point of 3 I'm going to make today. A basic high school chemistry course features principles like Le Chatelier's principle. And thinking about Le Chatelier's principle is going to help students think about why forming polymers is unlikely on the early Earth. Now, in our flow chart of the origin of life, here's where we're at. We just moved out of step 2 in prebiotic synthesis, and we're now in step 3. We need to connect those basic small molecules we made in step 2 and make long molecules, or polymerize them. Now, a few points to make about this. Here's the first thing I'm going to do. I am going to assume from step 2 there, I'm just going to ignore any problems that arose in prebiotic synthesis experiments that don't actually simulate early Earth conditions. I'm going to forget all about that, and I'm going to grant that somehow monomers did form on the primitive Earth. And in doing so, origin of life theorists now need to explain, how did polymerization happen? How did this occur? Well, let's investigate this through the lens of a high school student. If you're not familiar with polymerization, you might be familiar with the cars of a train. Connect them together and you get a long train. Connect our small building blocks of life together and you form a long polymer, a process called polymerization. Now, using Le Chatelier's principle to understand these obstacles to polymerization is what we're going to think about next. And so it's helpful to first understand how polymerization occurs. It's a dehydration synthesis reaction. And that word literally in English translates the D, removal, hydration, water. Literally, polymerization reactions remove water. And so a simple diagram of this looks like the following. I have my 2 small monomers. I'm going to connect them together, but notice the product contains water. Again, depolymerization reactions remove water. Now, in a more technical sense, instead of doing blobs, here's an amino acid, here's my second amino acid, these are monomers, and I'm going to connect them into a 2 amino acid polymer. But again, notice, water is produced. Now, how does this connect to our high school students? Well, recall, they're learning about Le Chatelier's principle and polymerization. Chem students understand that reactions can run forward and backwards, and they understand that reactions can reach equilibrium. And when they do, if that equilibrium is disturbed in any way, the reaction direction can change to reestablish a new equilibrium. Now, I teach my students about Le Chatelier's principle, which holds that a reaction will not tend to go forward in the presence of its products. And so what I see here is, when I think about this in the context of polymerization, here's what I see. There's my polymerization reaction. It's at equilibrium. Well, suddenly I place this reaction in a lot of water, one of the products. And when I do so, suddenly the reaction shifts towards the reactants. Notice, instead of connecting my monomers into a polymer, when I run this reaction in the reverse direction, I'm actually breaking up my polymer back to the small pieces. Well, that's not what origin of life needs, but that's what's happening. Now, think about this. What is the primordial soup full of? Water. Lots of water. And so Here's a terrific quote from Origin of Life researcher Stephen Benner. And along with his colleague here, Alonso Ricardo, quote, 2 amino acids do not spontaneously join in water. Rather, the opposite reaction is thermodynamically favored at any plausible concentrations. Polypeptide chains spontaneously hydrolyze in water, yielding their constituent amino acids. And the same is true for RNA and DNA. Notice our researchers are confirming this. Now, here in an image, you can see, in other words, this means that water is breaking protein chains back down into amino acids, a process we can just call depolymerization. What is the take-home message for the high school student? Well, it's basically water in the prebiotic soup stops polymerization. Right? Basic laws of chemical reactions like Le Chatelier's principle work against chemical evolution. Relying on blind, unguided chemical evolution to polymerize these basic molecules into larger biomolecules is problematic, not in spite of, but because of the basic concepts students are learning in high school chemistry. And so the extra credit here is students should be thinking, well, cells are made of water. Cells are aqueous environments. So how do cells get around this problem with Le Chatelier's principle to polymerize monomers into larger biomolecules? The answer is cells have enzymes, molecular machines that have the ability to overcome chemical barriers posed by Le Chatelier's principle. But of course, there were no enzymes present on early Earth to help solve this problem. Functional enzymes require genetic information, and that comes from a mind. So the solution again is ID. Now our final last point for the day is point 3. Basic chemical principles now, not of Le Chatelier's, but of osmosis and diffusion, can show why a primitive cell membrane could not protect your early forms of life. And so in our final point here, realize we have now made it to step 4 of the Origin of Life proposed steps. And realize again, let's just be really nice, everybody. Let's assume that step 2 and step 3 are sorted. We're gonna grant we've made our basic monomers, we've linked them together in polymerization. So now the next step for the Origin of Life researcher is to put these new molecules into vesicles that are going to protect them from degradation from their surrounding environment. Once again, let's think about this like a high school kid, all right? So case study here is a student in a high school chem class is already learning about osmosis and diffusion and why this poses a major challenge to the origin of life. In most living cells, you've got this protective membrane that is protecting the contents of that cell from the exterior. And what Origin of Life researchers proposed, what do we have to take the place of this? Well, let's take a look. What are these primitive protocells? 1970s biochemist Sidney Fox and colleagues believed that they had uncovered primitive cell membranes, like structures called protonoid microspheres. Others have called them coacervates, so 2 possible structures. And these structures lack metabolism and lack the ability to self-replicate. More importantly, they cannot perform the basic protection of keeping the bad stuff out and the good stuff in. They can't discriminate between nutrients, waste, and toxic chemicals. Instead, stuff is just entering and exiting the cell on the same principles of osmosis and diffusion that a chemistry student is learning about. So what's diffusion? In a nutshell, it's the movement of molecules from high to low concentration. You can see this with food coloring here as it spreads itself out. Our molecules move from concentrated to less concentrated. Students also learn about osmosis, the movement of water from high water to low water, or the movement towards highly concentrated solute across a semi-permeable membrane. And a semi-permeable membrane is something that allows some things in, but doesn't allow others to cross. So it's picky, if you will. Now, our modern cell membranes are much more than just a passive semi-permeable membrane. In fact, our modern cells are smart membranes. They're filled with specialized molecular machines that control traffic across that membrane and discriminate between the good stuff and the bad stuff through a variety of biochemical pathways and molecular pumps. According to Campbell's biology textbook, which I used in college, it says one of the earliest episodes in the evolution of life may have been the formation of a membrane that enclosed a solution that was different from the surrounding solution while still permitting the uptake of nutrients and the elimination of waste. The ability of the cell to discriminate in its chemical exchanges with its environment is what? Fundamental to life. And the plasma membrane and its component molecules that make this selectivity possible. Notice, Campbell's biology recognizes you need a membrane for life. It's just that recognizing that is very different from explaining how it arose. And there's not really an explanation here. Now, primitive protocell membranes, like coacervates or protenoid microspheres, would lack any of these complex machines we saw in the previous slide to regulate traffic across the cell membrane. There would be no mechanism to keep the bad guys out and the good guys in. In fact, these primitive membranes are nothing like our smart membranes of modern cells and could not give early life the protection that it needs. Our Origin of Life researcher, Dr. Tour, says, protein-lipid complexes are the required passive transport sites and active pumps for the passage of ions and molecules through bilayer membranes, often with high specificity. He goes on to say, some allow passage for substrates into the compartment and others their exit. And he says cellular and organelle bilayers, which were once thought of as simple vesicles, are anything but. They're highly functional gatekeepers. At the end, he says the sonification of a few random lipids, polysaccharides, and proteins in a lab will not yield cellular lipid bilayer membranes. It's not enough. What is the take-home for the high school chem? Well, coacervates and protenoid microspheres are unable to counteract diffusion and osmosis or discriminate among nutrients, waste products, and toxic chemicals. Modern cell membranes are smart. They do have that ability, and they're able to work against the principles of osmosis and diffusion, in fact, sometimes maintaining concentration gradients. Extra credit here. The molecular machines in these smart barriers of modern cell membranes are encoded in the DNA through large amounts of information. And again, where in our experience does that information come from? It comes from a mind. My conclusion today is the following. Basic principles students learn in high school chemistry work against, not for, chemical evolution. Chemistry students understand their experiments are messy. They often don't go as planned. And a skilled chemist can help produce the desired result, but no such chemist would be hanging around on the early Earth. Le Chatelier's principle, or diffusion and osmosis, can only be overcome by specialized enzymes and molecular machines found only in modern cells. Again, those require intelligent design. And those are just a few examples that a high school chemistry student can start to appreciate how chemistry provides that foundational knowledge to evaluate. I just want to close with this. If you have a child or a friend has a child that's interested in our integrated chemistry and now biology courses, check us out at www.discoveryinstitute.academy. We would be excited to consider a student in the class with us. Obrigado.